Imagine England in the waning years of the 17th century. The air is heavy with uncertainty. Candlelight flickers across taverns where whispers of conspiracy ride the smoke. In London's narrow streets, the clatter of carriage wheels is joined by hushed debates about faith, loyalty, and the king himself. To some, the realm feels like a powder keg awaiting a spark, an ancient kingdom poised between loyalty to its crown and loyalty to its conscience. It is here, in this moment of tension, that the story of the Glorious Revolution begins. But to grasp its meaning, one must first step back and survey the broader canvas of Europe. This was no isolated island tale. Across the continent, old certainties were dissolving. The 30 Years' War had redrawn maps and scarred nations. The Protestant Dutch Republic thrived in defiance of Catholic Spain, while France under Louis XIV reached toward the grandeur of absolute monarchy. The question of how power should be balanced between ruler and ruled, between crown and faith, was no longer theoretical. It was lived daily in the struggles of peoples and parliaments alike. England, as ever, stood at the crossroads. At the center of this unfolding drama was King James II. A man of determination and conviction, James was also a Catholic monarch ruling a firmly Protestant nation. To his supporters, he was a legitimate sovereign defending his rights and strengthening his realm. To his critics, he was a threat to their liberties, an echo of foreign absolutism, and the living embodiment of fears long simmering since the Reformation, when James pressed his policies, favoring Catholics in appointments, maintaining a standing army loyal to the crown, and defying the traditional authority of Parliament. Many believed the old balance was collapsing. And then, in June 1688, the birth of a son shattered what fragile equilibrium remained. Until that moment, James's Protestant daughter Mary, married to William of Orange in the Netherlands, had been heir presumptive. Her accession promised continuity with Protestant tradition. The arrival of a Catholic male heir, however, threatened the establishment with the prospect of an enduring Catholic dynasty. For England's political nation, this was not merely a domestic affair. It was a crisis of identity and survival. It is from this fracture that the Revolution was born. Whispers in taverns grew into letters of invitation sent across the Channel. In the Dutch Republic, William of Orange weighed his decision carefully, knowing the risks of confronting a crowned king, but also sensing the weight of history on his shoulders. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable transitions of power in English history, a revolution described as glorious because it promised to resolve a national crisis without plunging the kingdom back into civil war. And so, as autumn clouds gathered over the English Channel, ships prepared to sail, and a nation braced for change, the story of the Glorious Revolution began to unfold. A story not only of monarchs and parliaments, but of the struggle to define liberty, authority, and the future of England itself. The European and English context of the late 17th century. To understand why 1688 became a decisive turning point, one must first trace the long shadows cast by earlier centuries. The England of James II did not exist in isolation. It carried within it the echoes of Reformation and Civil War, and it was bound by the wider European struggle between faiths, dynasties, and political ideals. The Glorious Revolution was not born overnight. It was the culmination of forces that had been shaping both England and Europe for more than 100 years. The story began in the reign of Henry VIII, more than a century earlier. What had once been a stable relationship between the English monarchy and the Roman Church shattered in the 1530s when Henry broke with the papacy. The king's desire for dynastic security, his longing for a male heir, collided with papal authority, and the result was seismic. With the Act of Supremacy, Henry declared himself head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, and centuries of religious tradition overturned. What seemed at first a personal quarrel between king and pope evolved into a national transformation, setting England on a path where politics and religion were fused inseparably. In the reign of Elizabeth I, the Church of England was firmly established, but not without cost. Catholics were marginalized, dissenters punished, and the Spanish Armada loomed as a symbol of continental Catholic might, seeking to undo Elizabeth's Protestant settlement. Though Elizabeth triumphed, her victory only deepened England's sense of standing at the front line of a greater European conflict. Protestant liberty against Catholic absolutism. This legacy carried forward into the 17th century, when the Stuart kings sought to rule not only as monarchs, but as arbiters of conscience. James I and his son Charles I both struggled to enforce religious uniformity, but in doing so, they provoked fierce opposition. When Charles I dissolved Parliament, levied taxes without consent, and sought to impose Anglican liturgy on Scotland, he sparked a chain reaction that would engulf the kingdom in civil war. The English Civil War of the 1640s was more than a domestic quarrel. It was part of the wider European struggle between absolutism and representative government, between uniformity and diversity of belief. Cavaliers and Roundheads clashed not only over power, but over the very meaning of sovereignty. When Charles I mounted the scaffold in 1649 and bowed his head to the executioner's axe, Europe trembled. A king chosen by God had been tried and executed by his own subjects. For monarchs across the continent, it was an act almost unthinkable. For the people of England, it was a signal that divine right was no longer absolute. Yet the experiment of a republic under Oliver Cromwell proved turbulent. Though Cromwell ruled with energy, his protectorate carried its own authoritarian weight. After his death, the pendulum swung back. The monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, but the ghosts of civil war remained. Trust between crown and parliament was fractured, and questions of religion were never truly settled. Beneath the surface calm of Restoration England, discontent simmered, waiting for the next spark. Meanwhile, beyond England's shores, Europe itself was scarred by religious strife. The 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648, had devastated Central Europe. Entire regions were laid waste. Cities were burned. Millions perished. What began as a quarrel between Catholic and Protestant princes in the Holy Roman Empire widened into a continental struggle for dominance. France, Spain, Sweden, and the Habsburgs were all drawn in. When the Peace of Westphalia finally ended the bloodshed, it did more than redraw boundaries. It enshrined the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their own states. Yet it also left a bitter legacy. Religion had become a weapon of statecraft, and confessional divisions ran deep. For England, the consequences were profound. The devastation of Germany underscored the dangers of unchecked religious conflict. At the same time, the rise of France under Louis XIV embodied the threat of Catholic absolutism at its zenith. Across the Channel, the Sun King reigned supreme from Versailles, his word law, his court a glittering symbol of centralized power. To many in England, James II's policies seemed an echo of Louis's grandeur and rigidity, a dangerous sign of where England might be headed. But Europe also offered another model, one far closer to England's future, the Dutch Republic. Born out of its own revolt against Catholic Spain in the late 16th century, the Netherlands had fought bitterly for independence. Out of war and struggle emerged a state that prized commerce, civic rights, and a measure of religious toleration. Its thriving ports and bustling markets were matched by a vibrant political culture, where power was not concentrated solely in the hands of a monarch, but distributed through provinces and assemblies. For English observers, the Dutch Republic was both a rival and an inspiration. Its fleets contested mastery of the seas, but its example of prosperity, liberty, and resilience against a greater Catholic power resonated deeply. When William of Orange, leader of this republic, married Mary, daughter of James II, a symbolic bridge was built between two traditions, England's embattled Protestantism and the Dutch model of pragmatic liberty. Thus, by the late 17th century, England stood at the intersection of competing legacies. From Henry VIII came the enduring entanglement of politics and religion. From Elizabeth came the sense of a Protestant nation besieged by Catholic powers. From the Civil War came the precedent of parliamentary resistance and the memory of tyranny. From Europe came warnings of absolutism's excesses, the scars of religious wars, and the example of Dutch freedom. It was in this crucible of experience that the glorious revolution took shape. The storm gathering in 1688 was not a sudden squall, but the culmination of decades, indeed centuries, of conflict, memory, and aspiration. The revolution would not only decide who sat upon the English throne, it would determine what kind of kingdom England would be and what model of governance it would project to the wider world. To see why the storm of 1688 gathered with such force, one must look back to the convulsions of the previous century, when king and parliament had already tested each other's limits in a struggle that split the nation, toppled a crown, and left a legacy no successor could ignore. The legacy of the English Civil War and Commonwealth, if the religious upheavals of the 16th century had sown the seeds of division, the mid-17th century brought those seeds to full and violent bloom. The struggle between Crown and Parliament, once confined to debate and petition, spilled onto battlefields and turned England into a nation at war with itself. Out of that crucible emerged a legacy that no monarch, not even James II, could ignore. The memory of a king undone by his people, a republic born in fire, and a restoration haunted by mistrust. The story began with Charles I, son of James I, who ascended the throne in 1625. He was a man of regal dignity, convinced of the divine right of kings, and yet also a figure tragically unable to bend with the winds of his age. Parliament demanded a voice in taxation and governance. Charles saw such demands as encroachments on sovereignty. He dismissed parliaments, raised funds through forced loans, and pursued policies that many saw as veiled absolutism. His religious policies proved even more combustible. Seeking to impose Anglican liturgy across his realms, Charles provoked the Presbyterian Scots into rebellion. When he attempted to rule without Parliament altogether, what became known as the Personal Rule, or the 11 Years' Tyranny, resentment hardened into defiance. By the early 1640s, distrust had deepened into crisis. Parliament raised its own armies, and England descended into civil war. The English Civil War split the kingdom in two, royalists known as Cavaliers rallying behind the king, and parliamentarians or Roundheads demanding limits on royal authority. Fields once filled with harvest became battlegrounds: Edgehill, Marston Moor, Naseby. Smoke rose over villages as neighbors fought neighbors, and families were torn apart by allegiance. The clash was not only of swords and muskets, but of visions. To the king, he reigned by God's will. To his opponents, sovereignty must be shared and liberty secured by law. The tide turned against Charles. Captured and put on trial, he faced a court that dared to assert the people's authority over a monarch. In January 1649, on a cold morning at Whitehall, Charles stepped onto the scaffold. Dressed in two shirts to prevent shivering from being mistaken for fear, he addressed the crowd calmly. Moments later, the axe fell, and with it, centuries of unchallenged royal supremacy. The shock reverberated across Europe. The divine right of kings, long unassailable, had been cut down with a single stroke. In the king's place arose an untested experiment, the Commonwealth. Power shifted to Parliament and, soon, to the formidable figure of Oliver Cromwell. A soldier of iron will and Puritan conviction, Cromwell became the embodiment of Republican rule. His new model army had already proven its strength in war. Now it became the backbone of his authority. Cromwell sought to build a godly republic, guided by discipline and moral reform. He dissolved parliaments that resisted him, censored theaters, and enforced laws against vice. Abroad, he waged war against Spain, secured Jamaica, and asserted England's naval power. At home, however, his rule bore the marks of authoritarianism cloaked in piety. Though some admired his vigor, many grew weary of military governance and the heavy hand of Puritan austerity. When Cromwell died in 1658, the edifice he had built crumbled swiftly. His son Richard lacked both the charisma and authority of his father. Parliament and army factions quarreled, and the experiment in republican government collapsed under the weight of division. By 1660, the nation, exhausted by 2 decades of upheaval, turned back to the monarchy. The Restoration brought Charles II, son of the executed king, back from exile. London greeted him with jubilation, bonfires, and bells. To many, it felt as though the old order had been reborn. Charles II, witty and charming, seemed the very opposite of his stern father and the austere Cromwell. His reign revived the court's splendor, the theater, and a sense of festivity absent for years. Yet beneath the merriment, old tensions remained unresolved. Parliament had not forgotten its power. The people had not forgotten their voice. The scars of war lingered, shaping suspicion on both sides. Religious divisions persisted. Catholics remained marginalized. Dissenters still distrusted. And in the background loomed the unresolved question of succession, for Charles II left no legitimate heir, and the crown would pass to his Catholic brother James. Thus, the Restoration, though it promised peace, carried within it the memory of civil war and the fear of its return. The ghost of Charles I's execution hovered over every political dispute. The memory of Cromwell's protectorate haunted every debate about liberty and order. These memories were not faint. They were living forces, shaping how men viewed their king, their parliament, and their God. By the time James II ascended the throne in 1685, England was already a nation, marked by the past. Its people had seen what unchecked monarchy could unleash. They had endured the rule of a republic that became military rule. They had welcomed back the monarchy, but insisted it never again rule unchecked. The Civil War and Commonwealth left behind not only scars, but lessons that would come to bear heavily in the crisis of 1688. Thus, by the time James II inherited the crown in 1685, England was already a kingdom haunted by memories of civil war and wary of monarchs who claimed too much, fears that would shape every judgment of the new king. James II's accession, 1685. When Charles II died in February 1685, the kingdom held its breath. The Restoration King, with all his wit and charm, left no legitimate heir. His passing marked not only the end of a reign, but the opening of a new and uncertain chapter. Onto the throne stepped his younger brother, James, Duke of York, a seasoned soldier and administrator, a man whose faith and temperament would soon place him at the center of one of England's most profound crises. The succession itself was uncontested. The laws of inheritance were clear, and James was the rightful heir. Crowds gathered in London, not in rebellion, but in solemn acknowledgement. Bells tolled, black cloth draped the streets, and proclamations announced the new king. For many, the transition seemed smooth, a moment of continuity rather than rupture. But beneath the ceremony lay unease. For James was openly Catholic in a kingdom that had defined itself for more than a century as Protestant. James II was no ordinary claimant. He had fought in continental wars, commanded fleets, and served as Lord High Admiral of England. His experience in arms and governance gave him a reputation for competence, even decisiveness. Yet these same qualities often hardened into inflexibility. Where his brother Charles had danced through crises with wit and compromise, James met them head-on, blunt and unyielding. He valued loyalty, discipline, and clarity. To his admirers, he was steadfast. To his critics, dangerously obstinate. Religion was the great fault line. Since Henry VIII's break with Rome, England had endured a century of conflict to defend its Protestant identity. The Civil War and the Restoration had reinforced the idea that Catholicism was not merely a private faith, but a political danger associated with foreign absolutism, papal interference, and threats to liberty. Charles II, though suspected of secret Catholic sympathies, had maintained the facade of Anglican conformity. James, by contrast, professed his Catholicism openly. He attended Mass without apology, surrounded himself with Catholic advisors, and made no effort to disguise his convictions. For the first months of his reign, however, James enjoyed surprising support. The memory of civil war was still raw, and many in England preferred stability at almost any cost. The rebellion of the Duke of Monmouth, an illegitimate son of Charles II, provided James with an early test of strength. Monmouth landed in the West Country in June 1685, rallying disaffected Protestants to his banner. But the uprising was poorly organized, and at Sedgemoor it was crushed with bloody efficiency. Monmouth was captured and executed, his followers subjected to brutal reprisals in the bloody assizes overseen by Judge Jeffreys. The message was unmistakable. James II would tolerate no challenge to his crown. This victory, however, concealed deeper tensions. The Monmouth Rebellion revealed how fragile loyalty to James truly was, how quickly religious suspicion could ignite into open revolt. It also showcased James's severity. Where Charles II might have tempered justice with mercy, James enforced the law with iron rigor. Admirers called it necessary discipline. Critics saw only cruelty. In the royal court, James set about building his government with trusted allies, many of them Catholic. He expanded the standing army, placing Catholics in key commands, and sought to override laws that barred them from holding office. To him, it was a matter of justice and loyalty. Why should men of his faith be excluded from serving their king? To Parliament and much of the political nation, it was something far more alarming: the slow construction of a Catholic monarchy within a Protestant state. James II's reign thus began with a paradox. He was legitimate beyond question, experienced in the arts of war and government, and determined to rule with strength. Yet every step he took seemed to remind England of its deepest anxieties: memories of Bloody Mary's persecutions, of Spanish and papal designs, of absolutist France looming across the Channel. The king was no tyrant in intention. He believed he was acting for the good of his people. But in a nation scarred by a century of religious conflict, his very identity embodied the danger so many feared. As 1685 gave way to 1686, England found itself in a delicate balance. The monarchy was secure, Parliament cautious, the people watchful. But beneath the surface calm, cracks spread. James II's strengths, his decisiveness, his conviction, his refusal to compromise, were the very qualities that would soon bring him into collision with the traditions of his kingdom. The stage was set for confrontation, not yet open, but inevitable, as crown and nation moved step by step toward the fateful revolution that would soon engulf them all. Thus, as the early triumphs of his reign gave way to unease, James began to reveal his true course, not through battles or rebellions, but through policies that would test the very foundations of England's Protestant identity. The controversial policies of James II. The first years of James II's reign, though marked by authority and decisiveness, soon revealed the deep fault lines between king and kingdom. Where Charles II had worn a mask of compromise, James pulled it away, determined to rule openly and according to conscience. Yet, conscience, for him, meant Catholic loyalty in a Protestant nation. What followed was not a descent into chaos at once, but a series of deliberate choices, policies that, taken together, would convince many that their king sought to remake England in the image of Catholic absolutism. The question of religion lay at the heart of every decision. James II believed that England's laws excluding Catholics from public life were unjust relics of prejudice. Determined to correct what he saw as wrongs, he appointed Catholics to offices long closed to them: advisors, military commanders, judges, even university officials. Posts that had traditionally been guarded as Protestant strongholds were now given to men of his own faith. At first, these appointments seemed limited, but gradually the pattern became unmistakable. To James, it was loyalty and merit that mattered. To his Protestant subjects, it was a creeping revolution. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge, long bastions of Protestant thought, felt the weight of the king's hand when Catholic fellows were installed over their protests. The courts, too, were reshaped. Catholic judges presided where once Anglican conformity had been the norm. James sought to enshrine his policies in law. In 1687, he issued the Declaration of Indulgence, suspending penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters alike. In theory, it promised religious liberty. In practice, it was seen as the king claiming the power to suspend laws at will, an assertion of royal prerogative against Parliament itself. To many Protestants, indulgence was a mask, toleration offered to all in order to advance the Catholics, who alone seemed to benefit from the king's appointments. The backlash was immediate. Bishops resisted, declaring that only Parliament had the authority to alter the laws of the realm. When James prosecuted the 7 bishops for seditious libel after they petitioned against his declaration, the trial gripped the nation. Crowds gathered outside Westminster Hall, cheering when the bishops were acquitted. In that moment, James's attempt to enforce Catholic toleration became a rallying point for those who feared arbitrary rule cloaked in the language of conscience. A standing army religion was not the king's only concern. James also believed a strong monarch required a strong army. Memories of civil war had made many Englishmen wary of large standing forces, seeing them as instruments of tyranny rather than guardians of peace. Traditionally, England relied on local militias, raised in time of war and disbanded in peace. But James thought such arrangements antiquated. He began to expand the standing army, stationing thousands of troops near London and elsewhere. At parades on Hounslow Heath, spectators saw not the part-time soldiers of old, but disciplined regiments drilled like their continental counterparts. The sight impressed some, but unsettled many more. An army of such size, under the king's personal command, looked less like defense against foreign foes and more like a sword pointed inward. Even more troubling were the officers James chose to command them. Once again, Catholics appeared in high positions, bypassing the laws of the land. To the king, these were loyal men he could trust in the hour of need. To the country, it looked like the construction of a Catholic army, a force designed to hold the nation in submission should Parliament resist. In taverns and coffee houses, whispers spread. What need had England of so many troops in peacetime? Why were Catholics promoted in defiance of law? The army, once a symbol of protection, became a living reminder of the king's determination to impose his will. The French connection. If James's domestic policies stirred unease, his foreign policy deepened suspicion. Across the Channel, France under Louis XIV stood as the very model of Catholic absolutism. The Sun King reigned supreme at Versailles, his word law, his armies the terror of Europe. To Protestant England, France was both rival and threat, embodying everything they feared: religious intolerance, centralized power, and unchecked monarchy. Yet James looked to Louis not with suspicion, but with admiration and alliance. As a fellow Catholic monarch, he saw in the French king both a natural ally and a model of royal authority. French envoys were welcomed at court. Diplomatic ties grew warmer. Rumors circulated that English policy was being shaped not in Westminster, but in Versailles. Trade and military matters only sharpened fears. Louis's France had long sought dominance in Europe, and many in England dreaded that James would tie the kingdom's fortunes to French ambitions. If the king leaned too heavily on France, England risked becoming a satellite of continental Catholic power rather than a sovereign Protestant realm. Parliament, already uneasy with the king's appointments and his army, now whispered of a broader design, a Catholic axis stretching from Paris to London, with the Pope as its spiritual head. The more James aligned himself with Louis, the more his subjects saw him not as an English king, but as a Catholic prince enthralled to foreign powers. The gathering storm. By the late 1680s, the picture was clear: a Catholic king, openly favoring men of his faith, a declaration of indulgence bypassing Parliament, a standing army swelling with Catholic officers, an alliance, formal or informal, with Catholic France. Each policy alone might have been explained, justified, even endured. Together, they formed a pattern too stark to ignore. To James, these were the acts of a conscientious monarch, restoring justice to the excluded, modernizing his defenses, securing alliances to protect his realm. To his subjects, they were the acts of a king bent on overturning the Protestant settlement and replacing it with a Catholic autocracy. The tension grew with each passing month. Sermons thundered from pulpits, pamphlets circulated in secret, and voices in Parliament spoke of liberties under threat. For many Englishmen, the reign of James II began to feel a less like continuity and more like a dangerous experiment, a test of whether their hard-won rights could survive the will of a king who stood apart from the faith of his people. The stage was set. What began in 1685 as an uneasy acceptance of a legitimate monarch was, by 1687, sliding toward confrontation. The king had staked his reign on principles he refused to abandon. The nation, wary and watchful, was moving steadily toward resistance. The collision between crown and country was no longer a question of if, but when. Thus, the mounting unease in pulpits, pamphlets, and parish halls soon spilled into the very heart of England's governance, where Parliament itself became the battleground for a clash, no longer avoidable: conflict with Parliament and the political nation. By the late 1680s, the tension between James II and his kingdom no longer simmered quietly. It had begun to boil. His controversial policies, already alarming in the eyes of many, collided head-on with the very institution that embodied the nation's political conscience: Parliament. What had once been the forum for compromise now became the stage for confrontation. And in that contest, James revealed not only his determination, but also the rigidity that would prove his undoing, clashing with Parliament. Since the days of Magna Carta, England's constitutional balance had rested on a fragile understanding. The king ruled, but he ruled with the council and often the consent of his lords and commons. The 17th century had tested this principle to breaking point. Charles I had sought to govern without Parliament and lost his head for it. The Restoration had reasserted Parliament's role, but the scars of past conflict made men vigilant against any whiff of royal absolutism. James II, however, seemed deaf to these lessons. Confident in his prerogative, he asserted the king's right to suspend and dispense with laws at will. To Parliament, this was not merely bold, but dangerous, a direct challenge to the foundation of the Commonwealth. When members questioned his actions, James dissolved sessions rather than endure debate. The result was paralysis. Parliament's voice was stifled, but its silence was not acquiescence. In taverns, pulpits, and pamphlets, discontent found new channels, spreading like fire through dry fields. The Declaration of Indulgence. The spark came in 1687 with James's Declaration of Indulgence. Cloaked in the language of tolerance, it suspended penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters. In principle, it seemed enlightened, an end to centuries of persecution, a promise of freedom of conscience. But to the political nation, it carried a darker implication. First, the declaration was issued not by Parliament, but by royal decree. By suspending laws without parliamentary consent, James claimed a power above the law itself. The echoes of tyranny rang loudly. If the king could set aside statutes at will, what barrier remained against absolutism? Second, the indulgence appeared less like broad toleration than calculated favoritism. While dissenting Protestants might benefit in theory, in practice it was Catholics who gained the most. Protestant gentry suspected that the king's true aim was to pave the way for Catholic supremacy under the guise of universal liberty. When James reissued the Declaration in 1688, he pressed even harder. He commanded that it be read aloud in every Anglican church across the realm. Here, in the heart of English Protestantism, he demanded a proclamation that many clergy regarded as an attack on the very faith they served. It was not only an order, but a test of loyalty, forcing the clergy to choose between obedience to the crown and fidelity to their conscience. The trial of the 7 bishops. The confrontation reached its crescendo with the case of the 7 bishops. Refusing to comply with the king's order, 7 senior prelates, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, petitioned James to withdraw the declaration. Their petition was respectful but firm, asserting that the king had no authority to suspend laws without Parliament. To James, this was not a plea, but an act of defiance. Furious, he ordered their arrest on charges of seditious libel. The image of bishops, spiritual leaders of the nation, hauled to the Tower of London shocked even the king's supporters. Crowds followed the prisoners with prayers and blessings. When they stood trial at Westminster Hall in June 1688, the event became a national drama. Courtroom benches overflowed. London's streets thronged with anxious onlookers. The prosecution argued that the bishop's petition incited rebellion. The defense countered that it merely appealed to law and conscience. For hours, arguments clashed beneath the vaulted roof of the hall, while outside, the city held its breath. At last, the jury retired, and when it returned, the verdict rang clear: not guilty. The reaction was electric. Bells pealed across London, bonfires lit the night, and crowds rejoiced as though a great victory had been won. The acquittal was more than a legal decision. It was a symbolic declaration that the king's power was not absolute, that conscience and law still held sway in England. The gathering of resistance for James. The trial was a disaster. In seeking to enforce obedience, he had only magnified opposition. The bishops, far from rebels, emerged as martyrs to liberty. The clergy, once divided, now united in resistance. The political nation, from gentry to merchants, saw in the verdict confirmation of their fears. The king was willing to crush the Church of England itself to advance his designs. Worse still, the timing could not have been more fateful. Barely weeks after the acquittal, news spread that Queen Mary of Modena had given birth to a son. The prospect of a Catholic dynasty stretching into the future transformed discontent into alarm. What had seemed like a temporary crisis now loomed as a permanent transformation of the English state. The conflict between James and Parliament was no longer theoretical. It had played out in public trials, in sermons, in the visible clash between crown and conscience. A king determined to rule without compromise had collided with a nation determined to preserve its faith and liberties. The balance was tipping, and the hour of decision drew near. The revolution was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching, borne on the tide of discontent, summoned by the will of those who believed that the liberties of England were slipping away. The bishop's acquittal was not the end of the struggle. It was the trumpet that announced the storm to come. And just as resistance to James reached its most defiant pitch, fate delivered a development that turned unease into alarm: the birth of a son, an heir whose arrival would transform discontent into full-blown crisis. The succession crisis. In June 1688, as storm clouds gathered over James II's reign, a single event transformed unease into alarm: the birth of a son. On the morning of June 10th, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth at St. James's Palace to a healthy boy, James Francis Edward Stuart. For the royal household, it was a moment of triumph, the long-awaited male heir who would secure the Stuart line. For the nation, it was something else entirely, a turning point that changed the nature of the crisis facing England. Until that moment, many had looked beyond James to the future with a measure of reassurance. His Protestant daughter Mary, married to William of Orange, stood as heir presumptive. Whatever storms James might stir in his own reign, the crown would eventually pass to a Protestant successor, ensuring continuity of faith and polity. The birth of a Catholic son shattered that fragile hope. No longer was the nation simply enduring a Catholic king for a generation. Now it faced the prospect of a Catholic dynasty stretching into the unknown future. Suspicion grew with startling speed. In a climate already heavy with distrust, rumors swirled that the child was not the queen's at all, that a healthy infant had been smuggled into the birthing chamber in a warming pan to replace a stillborn child. This tale, whispered in coffeehouses and repeated in sermons, spread like wildfire. Its plausibility mattered less than its symbolism. To many, it seemed confirmation that the crown was conspiring to impose Catholic rule by deception, cementing their deepest fears. The warming pan story, though almost certainly false, captured the imagination of a nation primed to believe the worst of its king. Pamphlets circulated, mocking the tale but also reinforcing its power. Even those who doubted the rumor recognized the larger truth it implied. The birth of a son removed the last safeguard. England now faced not merely a Catholic monarch, but the likelihood of a Catholic succession for generations to come. For James, the event should have been his moment of triumph. He had secured the male heir that his brother Charles never produced, a continuation of the Stuart line beyond question. Yet in the eyes of many of his subjects, the child was less a blessing than an omen. Celebrations at court were met with muted silence in the country. What the king saw as assurance of dynastic stability, the nation perceived as confirmation of its darkest nightmares. By the summer of 1688, the succession crisis had crystallized the conflict. Parliament and the political nation no longer imagined waiting out James's reign in patience. With the birth of the prince, the balance tipped from caution to resolve. Resistance became not only urgent, but inevitable, for the nation now believed its liberties and its faith were threatened not for a season, but for generations unborn. The stage was set. From whispered rumors to public trials, from contested declarations to the birth of an heir, the crisis of James II had escalated step by step. Now, in the summer of 1688, all the elements converged. The political nation would act, and the glorious revolution was no longer a distant possibility. It was about to begin. And so, as the birth of a prince turned uncertainty into dread, the question shifted from endurance to action. Who would lead England out of its peril, and by what hand could resistance be made real? The invitation of the Immortal Seven. The birth of Prince James Francis Edward had transformed England's unease into dread. The prospect of a Catholic dynasty stretching into generations unborn made resistance no longer a question of whether, but of how. Yet the forces arrayed against James II were fragmented, fearful of open rebellion after the bloody lessons of Monmouth's defeat. If the nation were to act, it required leadership. an external figure who could rally disparate factions under a single banner. That figure, many believed, could only be William of Orange. William, stadtholder of the Dutch Republic and husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, was no stranger to the struggle against Catholic power. His life had been forged in the crucible of Europe's wars against Louis XIV. To many English Protestants, William stood not merely as a foreign prince, but as a defender of their faith, a symbol of resistance against absolutism. His marriage to Mary tied him directly to England's royal line, giving him both legitimacy and purpose. In this moment of peril, 7 men, earls, lords, and a bishop, took a fateful step. They would later be known as the Immortal Seven. United not by friendship but by necessity, they represented the spectrum of England's political elite. Whigs who had long opposed royal overreach, Tories who had once defended monarchy but now recoiled at James's excesses. Together they resolved to act. Their plan was audacious yet simple: invite William to intervene. They drafted a letter written in cautious but urgent tones and smuggled it across the Channel. The message was clear. The nation, they declared, was ready to support William if he landed with a small force. The people, weary of James's policies, would rise in his favor. The invitation framed William not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer, called to safeguard both Protestantism and the liberties of England. The letter carried with it the weight of history. Its signatories risked everything: lands, titles, even their lives. Treason against a reigning king was no light matter, and discovery would mean ruin. Yet the gravity of the moment demanded boldness. As their pens scratched across parchment, they cast their lot not only with William, but with the future of the kingdom itself. In the candlelit halls of Dutch palaces, the letter was delivered into William's hands. He read it with measured calm, his sharp eyes betraying little. For years he had battled Louis XIV, often with limited resources and fragile alliances. Now, across the sea, opportunity beckoned. England, long a hesitant partner, might be brought firmly into the struggle against France. And with Mary's claim, William's intervention could be framed not as foreign invasion, but as the rightful defense of England's Protestant settlement. Yet William was cautious. He understood the enormity of what was asked. To sail against a crowned king was to risk war not only with James, but perhaps with France as well. Failure would mean disaster for him and for the Dutch Republic. But success promised the transformation of Europe's balance of power. The invitation of the Immortal Seven was more than a letter. It was the crossing of a threshold. With their appeal, England's crisis was no longer confined within its shores. It became part of a wider European drama, linking the fate of a kingdom to the contest between Protestant liberty and Catholic absolutism. As summer deepened into autumn in 1688, whispers spread through Europe's courts. A prince across the sea had been summoned, a king's authority questioned, a revolution plotted in secret. The die was cast, though the outcome remained uncertain. In the shadows of intrigue and the flicker of candlelight, the first chapter of the glorious revolution moved from whispered conspiracy toward open action. Thus, when the secret letter reached The Hague, it did not arrive as mere ink on parchment. It arrived as a summons, and William of Orange, weighing its peril and promise, prepared to answer. William's campaign, 1688. The letter of the Immortal Seven had crossed the Channel like a spark carried by the wind. When it reached the hands of William of Orange in The Hague, it ignited more than a personal decision. It set in motion one of the most daring enterprises of the 17th century. The prince, long hardened by years of war against Louis XIV, understood both the danger and the promise of the invitation. To intervene in England was to gamble everything: his life, his crown, and the future of Europe. Preparations in the Dutch Republic. William began at once to prepare, but with the caution of a man who knew that one misstep could ruin all. In council chambers lined with maps and lit by flickering candlelight, he and his advisers debated the scale of the expedition. England could not be taken by half measures. If he landed with too small a force, he might meet the same fate as Monmouth. Too large a force, and his arrival would look less like a rescue than an invasion. To the Dutch Estates General, William presented his cause as more than dynastic ambition. It was a defense of Protestant liberty, not only in England but across Europe. He argued that James II's alliance with Louis XIV threatened the delicate balance of power. If England fell permanently into the orbit of Catholic France, the survival of the Dutch Republic itself would be imperiled. Better then to act boldly now than to await inevitable subjugation. His arguments carried weight. The Dutch, weary of French aggression, recognized the stakes. Gold was secured, ships were provisioned, and regiments mustered. From the provinces came men hardened in the wars against Spain and France. Disciplined soldiers and sailors who understood that this campaign might shape the destiny of Christendom itself. Diplomacy and the shadow of France. Yet William knew that armies alone would not decide the issue. Diplomacy was as crucial as powder and shot. Letters were dispatched to princes and statesmen across Europe, framing his expedition not as conquest, but as liberation. He assured them that he came not to seize the English crown for himself, but to safeguard the rights of Mary, his wife, and to preserve the Protestant religion. Still, one specter haunted every council: France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, cast a long shadow over Europe. If France moved decisively to defend James II, William's gamble might end before it began. To forestall this, William sought assurances from allies. The Holy Roman Emperor, embroiled in wars against the Ottoman Turks, welcomed any distraction to check France. German princes, wary of Louis's ambitions, offered sympathy if not soldiers. Spain, though weak, leaned toward tacit support. By autumn, William had woven a fragile but vital web of diplomatic cover. France was distracted in the Rhineland. Louis could not easily spare forces to aid James. The seas, though dangerous, might yet be crossed without facing the full might of French naval power. The hour had come. The Great Armada of Liberty. In the ports of the Dutch Republic, preparations reached a fever pitch. Shipwrights labored day and night, rigging masts and caulking hulls. The harbors of Rotterdam and Helvoetsluis swarmed with soldiers, sailors, and horses. Over 400 ships were assembled, an armada greater even than that which Spain had sent a century before. On their banners was not the emblem of conquest, but of cause: the Protestant religion and the liberties of England. The sight was astonishing. Villagers crowded the quays to watch as ranks of cavalry horses were led aboard transports, as cannon were hoisted into holds, as barrels of powder and biscuit were stacked high. To some, it seemed as though the very fate of nations had been gathered into the Dutch harbors. The autumn winds carried the creak of rigging and the prayers of sailors, mingling with the sense that history itself was setting sail. At the head of this armada stood William, calm and resolute. He was no flamboyant monarch, no gilded figure in the style of Louis XIV. Clad in armor plain but serviceable, his stern demeanor spoke of discipline, duty, and destiny. To those around him, he seemed less like a conqueror than a commander of Providence itself. The crossing and the storm. In October 1688, the armada was ready. The sails billowed and anchors were raised. Yet the sea, fickle and treacherous, reminded all that it too had a voice in history. A sudden storm swept across the channel, scattering ships and forcing the fleet to return battered to harbor. To James II, news of the storm seemed like divine intervention, a sign that God himself had dashed William's plans. At court, the king's supporters rejoiced, proclaiming that Providence had defended the rightful sovereign. But the respite was fleeting. By early November, the winds shifted. Once again, William ordered the fleet to sea. This time, fortune favored him. The same winds that carried his armada across the channel blew James's navy into the wrong waters, leaving England's coasts unguarded. For days, sails filled the horizon, a forest of masts stretching as far as the eye could see. Villagers along the southern coast gazed in awe and dread as the greatest fleet England had ever witnessed approached, not under the banner of Spain or France, but under the standard of William of Orange. The landing at Torbay. On November 5th, 1688, a date already etched in English memory as the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot, the Armada anchored off Torbay in Devon. William's troops disembarked onto English soil, their banners snapping in the wind, their ranks disciplined and orderly. The prince himself stepped ashore, solemn and unflinching, as if to announce not conquest, but deliverance. The symbolism was powerful. By landing on November 5th, William cast himself as the antithesis of Catholic treachery, the protector of Protestant England against tyranny and deceit. Local inhabitants, cautious at first, began to offer provisions. Within days, nobles and officers defected from James's cause, swelling William's camp. For James II, the news was devastating. His army, though large on paper, wavered in loyalty. His officers, many Protestant, hesitated to fight against a prince who claimed to defend their religion. Panic spread through the court. The king, who only months earlier had seemed unassailable, now found himself abandoned, his authority crumbling like sand in the tide. The March of Destiny. William advanced slowly but steadily, his army moving through the western counties toward London. He issued proclamations assuring the people that he sought not conquest, but the preservation of liberties and the Protestant faith. Each step drew new allies. Each village passed added to the sense of inevitability. The campaign was less a clash of arms than a shifting of allegiance. Whole regiments deserted James, nobles opened their estates to William, and towns declared for the prince. By the time winter approached, William's march had become less invasion than procession, as though the kingdom itself were delivering him to the throne. Thus the campaign of 1688 unfolded, not as a storm of battle, but as a storm of conscience. In Dutch harbors it had begun with daring preparations and fragile alliances. On the seas it had risked ruin and won deliverance by the winds. On English shores it manifested not in slaughter, but in defections, proclamations, and the quiet turning of hearts. By the time William reached the outskirts of London, James II's fate was sealed. The crown had not been seized by force, but eroded by mistrust, abandoned by its own defenders, and surrendered to the tide of history. The glorious revolution had entered its decisive phase, and England stood on the threshold of transformation. Yet William's steady advance was only half the story, for the prince's rise was matched by the king's unraveling. James II's authority, once draped in majesty, now began to fray with every desertion and betrayal. The collapse of James II's power, the landing at Torbay, had been the spark. The march of William's army through the western counties became the flame. But it was the unraveling of James II's own support, the defections of soldiers, nobles, and even his family, that turned the flame into a conflagration. What unfolded in the final weeks of 1688 was not the sudden fall of a tyrant in battle, but the slow disintegration of royal authority, dissolving piece by piece until the king himself fled the kingdom he once ruled. The desertion of the army. At first, James II still commanded a formidable force. His army outnumbered William's, and in the early days of the invasion, he gathered his troops near London to plan a counterstroke. From Whitehall, orders were issued, scouts dispatched, and loyalists summoned. But strength on parchment proved fragile on the field. One by one, his officers began to falter. Men who had sworn oaths to their king wavered when faced with William's proclamations promising defense of Protestantism and liberty. Entire regiments hesitated to fight against a prince who seemed less an invader than a deliverer. Defection became a tide. First, a trickle of desertions, then a flood. The most devastating blow came when John Churchill, a rising commander in James's army, later famed as the Duke of Marlborough, abandoned his king. Along with other officers of stature, Churchill slipped into William's camp, carrying with him not only military expertise, but the aura of inevitability. When the king's most trusted generals deserted, how could common soldiers stand firm? The nobility turns. The aristocracy, too, shifted allegiance. Great landowners who had once dined in James's halls now opened their estates to William's advance. Towns and counties declared for the prince, their leaders convinced that James's cause was lost. The peers of the realm, long accustomed to balancing loyalty to the crown with defense of their privileges, made their calculation. To remain with James was to risk ruin. To join William was to align with history's momentum. Even within the royal family, betrayal cut deep. James's own daughter Anne fled the court to join William's supporters. For the king, this was more than political loss. It was personal devastation. He is said to have cried out in despair, "Even my children have forsaken me." The image of a monarch, abandoned not only by soldiers and nobles, but by his blood, symbolized the collapse of all that sustained his throne. The king's despair, James II, who had once exuded firmness, now faltered. Reports of defections arrived daily, each eroding his confidence further. The court at Whitehall, once bustling with ceremony, grew quiet, corridors echoing with uncertainty. Ministers whispered in corners. Servants looked anxiously to the future. In moments of candor, James confessed his sense of betrayal. His army had not fought. His generals had deserted. His nobility had turned. The foundations of monarchy, loyalty, and fear had crumbled. To strike out in battle now seemed less like valor than futility. On the night of December 11th, 1688, James attempted to flee. Disguised and desperate, he cast the Great Seal of England into the Thames as he fled the capital, a symbolic gesture that authority itself had been abandoned. But his escape was clumsy. He was captured near Faversham and brought back in humiliation. The once mighty king, now a fugitive in his own realm. The flight to France. Yet fate allowed him a second chance. With William advancing ever closer and his own position untenable, James was permitted, perhaps even quietly encouraged, to leave England. On December 23rd, he boarded a vessel on the Kentish coast with his queen and infant son, James Francis Edward. The winds that had once delivered William now carried James away across the Channel to France. At the court of Louis XIV, the fallen monarch found refuge. Versailles, with its gilded halls and endless galleries, received him as a king in exile. But in England, his departure was seen not as temporary absence, but abdication. A sovereign who fled in the hour of trial had, in the eyes of many, relinquished his crown. The end of a reign. Thus ended the reign of James II, not with a climactic battle, but with a collapse of trust. His soldiers deserted, his nobles defected, his family abandoned him. He fled not once but twice until at last he crossed the sea for good. What remained was a throne empty in fact, if not yet in law, awaiting the settlement that Parliament and the political nation would soon craft. It was a quiet fall for a king of such ambitions. No triumphant enemy had stormed his capital. No sword had struck him down. Instead, his reign dissolved in mistrust, fear, and desertion. The collapse of James II revealed a truth that would echo through England's history. A monarch who rules without the trust of his people, who defies their conscience and their parliament, may sit on a throne, but he does not hold power. And so, as the year 1688 drew to a close, the king was gone, the crown vacant, and the stage set for a new order. The glorious revolution had triumphed not by force of arms, but by the erosion of allegiance. A dynasty had fled into exile, and England stood on the threshold of a transformed monarchy. And it was in that vacancy of power, an empty throne left behind by flight rather than conquest, that contemporaries began to remark upon the unusual character of England's upheaval, a revolution made not in battle, but in bloodless transition. The idea of a bloodless revolution. As James II fled across the Channel and William of Orange advanced toward London, observers began to marvel at the manner of the king's fall. Revolutions in Europe usually came with rivers of blood, with barricades and executions, with towns laid waste, and fields scarred by battle. Yet here, in the autumn of 1688, England seemed to be remade with scarcely a sword drawn. This was not to say there had been no violence at all. In scattered places, confusion and tension had sparked skirmishes. At Reading, townsmen clashed with royal troops. In other districts, nerves frayed and shots were fired. But these were exceptions, brief and contained, leaving nothing like the devastation of civil war a generation earlier. Compared to the burning of cities in the 30 Years' War or the slaughter at Naseby, the disorders of 1688 were little more than shadows. It was this restraint that gave rise to the notion of a bloodless revolution. The great transformation, the deposition of a king, the invitation of a foreign prince, the remaking of monarchy itself had occurred without the torrents of violence that usually accompany such upheavals. Instead, power shifted through defections, declarations, and the erosion of allegiance. It was not swords that toppled James, but the collapse of trust, not cannon fire that crowned William, but the consent of Parliament and people. Why, then, was it called glorious? Partly for the outcome it produced, the preservation of Protestant liberty, the securing of parliamentary power, and the promise of stability after decades of upheaval, but also for the manner in which it was achieved. To contemporaries and later generations alike, the Revolution of 1688 seemed a miracle of moderation, a moment when England remade itself not by destroying, but by redirecting its course. The truth was more complex, of course. There had been fear, betrayal, and tension. There had been plots and moments of violence. Yet in the grand scale of European history, the English Revolution stood out as a rare thing, a political earthquake achieved without descending into slaughter. In that sense, it was not only glorious, but exceptional, an upheaval that left behind not ruins, but the foundation for a new constitutional order. Yet if the revolution seemed bloodless, its aftermath was anything but simple. For once James had fled, England was left with a throne empty in law and in practice, forcing Parliament to decide not only who should rule, but how a king and kingdom should be bound together. William and Mary as joint monarchs, with James II gone into exile and the throne effectively vacant, England entered a moment of extraordinary uncertainty. The king had not abdicated formally, yet by fleeing the realm he had abandoned his duty. A monarchless kingdom demanded a settlement. What followed in the winter of 1688 to 1689 was not only a crisis of succession, but a debate over the very nature of monarchy itself. The settlement with Parliament convened in January 1689 to resolve the question of authority. The peers and commons assembled in Westminster, aware that the eyes of the nation, and indeed of Europe, were fixed upon them. Should James be restored? Could he be negotiated with? Or was his flight, casting the Great Seal into the Thames, tantamount to abdication? Voices rose in argument. Some Tories hesitated, uneasy with the notion of deposing an anointed king. Others, recalling the chaos of his reign, insisted that James had broken the contract of trust upon which monarchy rested. Gradually, a consensus emerged. James had abdicated by deserting his kingdom. The throne, therefore, was empty, awaiting a new sovereign. But who? The answer was not simple. William had led the expedition, rallied support, and held the reins of power by sheer fact. Yet his wife, Mary, was the daughter of James II and thus the natural heir. To crown William alone would seem foreign usurpation. To crown Mary alone would render William subordinate. The solution required a delicate balance between bloodline and conquest, between legitimacy and necessity. The offer of the Crown Parliament, after careful negotiation, offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. In their chambers, lit by winter's pale light, the two received the proposal. Mary, dutiful and pious, had little desire to rule without her husband. William, pragmatic and ambitious, knew that his power in England must rest on her hereditary claim. Together they accepted, not as conquerors, but as monarchs chosen by Parliament's voice. It was an unprecedented arrangement. Never before had England crowned two sovereigns to reign together, equal in title and authority. The symbolism was profound. The throne was no longer the personal possession of a single dynasty, but the outcome of political agreement. By making William and Mary joint rulers, Parliament fused conquest with legitimacy, necessity with principle. Mary's role as daughter of James. Mary's presence was essential to this settlement. As the eldest daughter of James II, she carried the bloodline of the Stuarts, linking the new regime to the old. To many who feared foreign domination, her coronation was reassurance. England's monarchy was still English. She was not merely consort, but queen regnant, her lineage sanctifying the transfer of power. For William, Mary's role gave moral force to his cause. Without her, he might have been branded an invader. With her, he was a husband defending his wife's inheritance, a prince called not to usurp, but to preserve. The union of their claims, his by arms, hers by blood, created a legitimacy stronger than either could command alone. The coronation, on April 11th, 1689, in the great nave of Westminster Abbey, William and Mary were crowned together. The ancient stones, which had witnessed centuries of kings, now beheld something entirely new, two monarchs sharing the same throne. The Archbishop of Canterbury, though absent in protest, was replaced by loyal prelates. Prayers rose, choirs thundered, and the anointing oil marked them both as sovereigns. The crowds outside cheered with relief as much as joy. After years of fear, rumor, and division, the kingdom had a monarch again. Indeed, two monarchs. Yet the symbolism was unmistakable. This was no ordinary coronation. It was the ratification of a revolution, the visible sign that monarchy in England had been reshaped by Parliament's will. A new balance of power. The joint reign of William and Mary embodied a new constitutional order. Power no longer flowed solely from divine right. It was now negotiated, balanced, and conditioned by law. The monarchy survived, but in a form that acknowledged Parliament as its partner. For contemporaries, the settlement was nothing short of astonishing. A Catholic king had been deposed without battle, a foreign prince had been invited to rule, and a Protestant daughter of the old dynasty had legitimized the new. What might have been chaos had been transmuted into stability. The Revolution of 1688, sealed in the coronation of 1689, was not only glorious for its lack of bloodshed, but for its capacity to fuse tradition with change, inheritance with consent. Thus, William and Mary ascended the throne together, a king and queen, bound not only by marriage, but by history's demand. Their joint rule stood as both a compromise and a declaration that monarchy in England was no longer absolute, but constitutional. In that transformation lay the true glory of the Revolution. Yet the very settlement that placed William and Mary upon the throne raised a larger question. If monarchy was now constitutional, what laws would bind it? And what safeguards would protect the liberties for which the Revolution had been fought? The Bill of Rights, 1789. The joint coronation of William and Mary in Westminster Abbey marked the resolution of the immediate crisis, but it did not settle the deeper question: what kind of monarchy would now reign in England? James II had fled into exile because he had overreached his authority, placing his will above the laws of the land. If the nation were to avoid a return to tyranny, there had to be limits, rules written not merely in custom, but in law. Thus, in the winter and spring of 1689, Parliament drafted a document that would shape not only England's destiny, but the political future of the modern world, the Bill of Rights. The origins of the Bill. The Bill of Rights was born not in sudden inspiration, but in centuries of struggle. From Magna Carta in 1215 to the Petition of Right in 1628, Englishmen had long sought to define the boundaries of royal power, but the upheavals of the 17th century had brought these struggles to a climax. The execution of Charles I, the Protectorate under Cromwell, the Restoration, and now the Glorious Revolution. Each episode was a chapter in a continuing argument between authority and liberty, crown and Parliament. In 1689, Parliament resolved to codify that argument once and for all. The settlement offered to William and Mary was not unconditional. They were invited to the throne on the understanding that they accepted a new framework of governance. Their power, unlike that of their predecessors, would be defined and constrained by written law. Key provisions. The Bill of Rights, presented to the new monarchs in December 1689, contained a series of declarations that cut to the heart of sovereignty. Its clauses spoke with clarity, setting boundaries that no king or queen could ignore. 1. Limits on royal authority. The bill declared that the monarch could not suspend or dispense with laws without Parliament's consent. No taxation could be imposed without parliamentary approval. Standing armies in peacetime were forbidden unless authorized by Parliament. In these words lay the undoing of James II's abuses, his suspension of penal laws, his imposition of Catholic officers, his growing army under royal command. 2. Protection of parliamentary power. Elections to Parliament were to be free, and parliamentary debates were to enjoy freedom of speech. No king could intimidate or punish members for the words spoken in their chamber. This provision, simple yet profound, ensured that the representatives of the nation could speak without fear, a cornerstone of parliamentary independence. Third, rights of the subjects were granted the right to petition the king without fear of retribution, a direct rebuke to James II's prosecution of the 7 bishops. Excessive bail and cruel punishments were prohibited, affirming principles of justice that echoed through later centuries. The right to bear arms for self-defense within the law was recognized, a measure designed to prevent the crown from monopolizing force. Fourth, succession secured. To guard against the return of Catholic absolutism, the bill stipulated that no Catholic could ascend the throne. This provision, controversial even then, reflected the central anxiety of the age, that the liberties of England depended upon a Protestant succession. A turning point in monarchy, the Bill of Rights was more than a list of grievances redressed. It was a blueprint for a new kind of monarchy. No longer could the crown claim to rule by divine right alone. Its authority was now conditional, dependent upon the consent of Parliament, and bound by the rights of subjects. This was a revolution not of swords but of statutes. With the stroke of the quill, England shifted from absolute monarchy toward constitutional monarchy. The king was still the head of state, crowned and anointed, but his power was now circumscribed by law. Parliament had emerged not as an advisory body, but as a partner in governance, its role enshrined and protected. For William, this settlement was acceptable. He sought stability in England to sustain his wider struggle against France. For Mary, it was an act of filial paradox. As daughter of James II, she legitimized the throne from which he had been cast out, but on terms that denied the absolutism he had claimed. Together, their acceptance of the Bill of Rights cemented the transformation of monarchy itself. Symbolism and reception. To contemporaries, the Bill of Rights carried immense symbolic weight. It was hailed as the Second Magna Carta, a new charter of liberties for the English people. Pamphleteers praised it as the triumph of law over tyranny, of Parliament over prerogative. In coffeehouses and taverns, its provisions were read aloud, debated, and celebrated. There were critics, of course. Some lamented the exclusion of Catholics. Others doubted whether the liberties proclaimed would be truly enforced. But for the vast majority, the bill represented hope that never again would England endure the rule of a monarch who placed himself above law and conscience. The imagery of the time captured this sentiment. Artists depicted William and Mary as protectors of liberty, holding the scroll of the Bill of Rights as though it were a sacred covenant. Sermons likened the settlement to the Israelites delivered from Pharaoh, a nation redeemed from bondage. The revolution, once fraught with uncertainty, now seemed clothed in providential purpose. The legacy. The Bill of Rights of 1689 was not perfect, nor was it the final word on liberty, yet it marked a decisive step in the evolution of modern democracy. By limiting royal power and affirming parliamentary sovereignty, it laid the foundations of constitutional government not only in Britain but far beyond. In the centuries that followed, its influence spread across the Atlantic to the American colonies, inspiring the United States Bill of Rights. Its principles echoed in the struggles of Europe, in debates over representation, taxation, and liberty. What began as a settlement of an English succession crisis became a cornerstone of global constitutionalism. Above all, the Bill of Rights transformed the meaning of monarchy in England. Kings and queens would still reign, but never again as absolute rulers. Their crowns rested not on divine right alone, but on the consent of Parliament and the liberties of the people. It was this balance, precarious yet enduring, that gave the Revolution of 1688 its true glory. The Bill of Rights was the capstone of the Glorious Revolution, where armies and defections had toppled James II, where Parliament had raised William and Mary to the throne. It was this document that gave the settlement permanence. With it, England declared that freedom was not the gift of kings, but the birthright of its people. Thus, in the year 1689, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster, the destiny of England was rewritten. The crown was tamed, Parliament empowered, and the rights of subjects enshrined. A kingdom once torn by civil war and threatened by tyranny had found in law and liberty the foundation of its future. The revolution was glorious not simply because it avoided bloodshed, but because it gave birth to a monarchy bound by law, a parliament secure in power, and a people newly conscious of their rights. In that settlement, England's path toward constitutional government truly began. Yet, if the Bill of Rights secured the crown within the bounds of law, another question still pressed upon the nation, the question of faith, for no constitutional order could stand firm while the old fires of religious strife still smoldered. The Toleration Act, 1689. Even as the ink dried on the Bill of Rights, Parliament turned to another question that had haunted England for more than a century, the question of conscience. Religion had been the spark of so many upheavals. The break with Rome under Henry VIII, the burnings under Mary Tudor, the Puritan triumph and downfall, the Restoration tensions, and now the Glorious Revolution. If this new settlement was to endure, it could not rest on political reform alone. It required a measure of religious peace. Out of this necessity emerged the Toleration Act of 1689. Protestant dissenters and a fragile peace. The act extended a measure of freedom to Protestant dissenters, those who worshipped outside the Church of England. Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, and Congregationalists, long hounded by penal laws, now found space to breathe. Under the Toleration Act, they were permitted to gather for worship, provided they swore oaths of allegiance to the crown and rejected doctrines seen as subversive, such as transubstantiation. Chapels appeared in towns and villages, no longer hidden, but cautiously public. Ministers who once faced prison could now preach openly, their congregations no longer forced to slip through back doors or gather in barns under cover of night. For many Englishmen, this was the first taste of religious liberty in their lifetimes, a reprieve from generations of persecution. Yet the peace was fragile. The act did not grant full equality. Dissenters were tolerated, not embraced. They remained barred from Oxford and Cambridge, excluded from civic office, and constrained by laws that preserved Anglican supremacy. Still, even with its limitations, the Toleration Act marked a profound shift. England had acknowledged that unity of faith could no longer be enforced by law without courting disaster, exclusions, and boundaries. But if Protestant dissenters gained breathing space, others remained excluded. Catholics, the great specter of the age, were denied any benefit from the act. In the eyes of Parliament, to tolerate Catholicism was to tolerate allegiance to the Pope, to invite the return of absolutism and foreign domination. The memory of Mary Tudor's fires, the plots of Jesuits, and James II's Catholic policies were too raw. For Catholics, the Revolution brought not relief, but renewed marginalization. Equally excluded were atheists, though the term was broad and imprecise in the 17th century. To deny the Christian faith altogether was seen as not only heresy, but subversion, a threat to the moral fabric of society. The Toleration Act drew lines as much as it opened doors. It widened the circle of acceptable belief, but it also reinforced boundaries of exclusion. Why toleration now? The Revolution had made toleration not an act of generosity, but one of necessity. William of Orange, himself a Calvinist ruler of a pluralistic Dutch republic, understood the futility of rigid uniformity. His new kingdom required unity in resistance against France and stability at home. A Protestant coalition was essential. Alienating dissenters would fracture the very base that had supported his invasion. Thus, toleration was offered not out of abstract philosophy alone, but out of pragmatic politics. The act was a calculated compromise, broad enough to bring Protestant dissenters into the fold, narrow enough to preserve Anglican establishment, and firm enough to exclude Catholics whose presence still evoked fear. It was a middle path shaped by the lessons of a century of blood and fire. A step toward liberty. Though limited, the Toleration Act of 1689 represented a turning point in the long march toward religious freedom. It did not establish equality, but it planted the principle that conscience could not be compelled by law. Over the decades to come, dissenting communities would grow stronger, their chapels multiplying, their voices gradually pressing for fuller rights. To contemporaries, the act felt like a release of pressure, a relief valve after decades of religious strife. Fires no longer consumed heretics in Smithfield. Soldiers no longer broke up secret conventicles with pikes and muskets. The kingdom, scarred by civil war and division, had chosen not to impose uniformity by force, but to allow diversity within boundaries. The Toleration Act stood beside the Bill of Rights as part of the Glorious Revolution's settlement, where the bill defined the rights of Parliament and people. The act defined, however imperfectly, the boundaries of conscience. It was incomplete, leaving Catholics and non-believers outside the circle of liberty. Yet for England in 1689, it was a remarkable achievement, a recognition that stability lay not in uniformity, but in a measure of freedom. And so, in the aftermath of revolution, the kingdom took a cautious but decisive step away from the fires of persecution. It did not end religious conflict, but it changed its course. The Glorious Revolution, remembered for its political achievements, was also a turning point in the history of conscience, a revolution not only of crowns and parliaments, but of souls. Yet the Glorious Revolution's legacy did not end with charters and acts. Its true weight was measured in how these new principles took root in English life, slowly reshaping the nation from within. Long-term domestic impact. The revolution of 1688 to 1689 was not merely a momentary upheaval, nor simply the replacement of one monarch with another. Its consequences reverberated through English society, reshaping the architecture of politics, law, and liberty. In the quiet years that followed, reforms rooted in the Revolution began to settle into the soil of the nation, transforming the relationship between crown, parliament, army, press, and people. The Glorious Revolution was glorious not only because it removed a tyrant without widespread bloodshed, but because it set in motion a new domestic order whose influence would endure for centuries. Parliament ascendant first and foremost, the Revolution entrenched the authority of Parliament. For generations, the balance between king and commons had swayed back and forth, contested on battlefields and in council chambers. The Bill of Rights and the settlement of 1689 now codified Parliament's supremacy. Kings and queens could still summon majesty, but they could not govern alone. No taxation could be levied without Parliament's consent, no standing army maintained without its approval, no law suspended at the monarch's whim. This principle, the power of the purse, became the cornerstone of parliamentary sovereignty. In the Commons, debate grew more confident. In the Lords, tradition combined with vigilance to guard liberty. What had once been fragile custom was now enduring law. The symbolism was immense. England's monarchy, though preserved, was now tethered. Royal decrees gave way to parliamentary statutes. Royal favor was checked by parliamentary oversight. In this recalibration of power, England forged the model of constitutional monarchy, a crown still glittering, but harnessed to the will of the nation's representatives. Civil-military relations recast. Equally transformative was the Revolution's impact on the army. James II's attempt to build a Catholic standing force had terrified his subjects, reviving memories of continental absolutism. In 1689, Parliament resolved that never again would the Crown alone command a permanent army in peacetime. The Mutiny Act, passed annually, became a crucial mechanism. It legalized military discipline only with Parliament's renewal, ensuring that the army's existence depended on parliamentary consent. Soldiers swore loyalty to the monarch, but the conditions of their service were shaped by the Commons. Thus, the sword of the state was placed not in the king's hand alone, but under civilian control. This transformation was subtle, yet profound. The English army did not vanish. Indeed, under William it grew, as wars against France demanded greater forces. But its political meaning changed. No longer was the army a potential instrument of tyranny. It was now a national institution restrained by law and parliament. The specter of arbitrary military rule receded, replaced by a constitutional balance between sword and statute. The foundations of press freedom. Another legacy of the Revolution was the gradual emergence of a free press. James II had sought to control opinion through censorship and licensing, restricting what could be printed and punishing dissenting voices. The Revolution, by curbing royal prerogative, weakened these instruments of control. Though not formally enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the principle of open debate flourished in its wake. Parliament itself depended on free discussion, and the people demanded access to news of their rulers. Coffeehouses buzzed with political argument, fueled by pamphlets, newsletters, and newspapers. The Licensing Act, which had enforced censorship, lapsed in 1695 and was not renewed. A quiet revolution within the revolution. The result was the birth of a public sphere. For the first time, politics in England unfolded not only in court and parliament, but in print and public opinion. Satirical cartoons, fiery sermons, and impassioned pamphlets circulated widely, shaping the nation's conscience. A monarch might attempt to silence his critics, but the tide of free expression, once loosed, could not easily be restrained. Rule of law strengthened. Underlying all these changes was the strengthening of the rule of law. The Revolution affirmed that law stood above king, that liberty was not a royal gift, but a national right. Courts gained confidence to assert their authority. Arbitrary imprisonment and cruel punishment were explicitly condemned. The Habeas Corpus Act, earlier passed in 1679, gained new vitality under the spirit of 1689. This legal settlement did not eliminate injustice. Catholics still faced exclusion, dissenters endured civil disabilities, and the poor remained without political voice. Yet the trajectory was set. By binding the monarchy within law, the Revolution created a framework in which liberty could grow. Over the centuries that followed, reformers would return again and again to the principles of 1689 to demand broader rights, arguing that the promises of the Glorious Revolution must be honored in full. The quiet permanence of change. In the years after William and Mary's coronation, England did not erupt in constant turmoil. Instead, the revolution's effects seeped slowly but irreversibly into daily life. Parliamentary debates became the heartbeat of governance. Soldiers marched under civilian command. Printers set type with greater boldness. Citizens petitioned their rulers with newfound confidence. What had once been contested at the cost of blood was now embedded in the routines of governance. The monarchy endured, but as one part of a constitutional order rather than its master. The revolution had not abolished tradition, it had redirected it. The crown still gleamed above Westminster, but now it gleamed within limits. The Glorious Revolution was not only an event, but a settlement, and not only a settlement, but a foundation. It transformed England from a realm of uncertain balances into a kingdom where parliament, law, and liberty were entrenched. Its domestic impact was not measured in battles fought, but in institutions strengthened, rights recognized, and power restrained. When later generations spoke of 1688 as glorious, they did not mean only the triumph of William and Mary. They meant the dawn of a new order, an England where monarchy was constitutional, the military subordinated to parliament, the press freer to speak, and law exalted above crown. It was a revolution carried not by fire and sword, but by parchment and principle. Its glory lay not in conquest, but in continuity reshaped, not in ruins, but in the enduring structures of a constitutional state. And in those quiet structures, the legacy of 1689 still endures. Yet the revolution, for all its domestic triumphs, could not be contained within England's shores. Its settlement inevitably pulled the kingdom into the wider currents of European rivalry, where William's lifelong enemy, Louis XIV of France, awaited war with France. The 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697. The Glorious Revolution had secured William III and Mary II upon the throne of England, but the revolution was never only an English affair. From the beginning, William's vision stretched far beyond the Channel. He had come not only to safeguard Protestant liberties at home, but to marshal England into the wider struggle that had consumed his life, the contest with Louis XIV of France, the most powerful monarch in Europe. Thus, scarcely had the revolution been settled than England found itself drawn into a great continental conflict, the 9 Years' War. William and the Grand Alliance. William was, above all, a statesman of Europe. Born and raised in the Dutch Republic, he had spent his life fighting to preserve its independence against French encroachment. For decades, Louis XIV had loomed as the colossus of the continent, his armies vast, his treasury immense, his ambition boundless. France's borders had expanded at the expense of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Low Countries. To William, Louis was not merely a rival, but an existential threat to the balance of power itself. Even before his landing in England, William's thoughts had been on this larger stage. With English resources at his command, he could forge a coalition strong enough to halt French dominance. In 1689, England formally joined the League of Augsburg, transforming what had been a defensive pact of German princes, the Emperor, Spain, and the Dutch, into the Grand Alliance, a pan-European coalition united against the Sun King. This was a profound shift in England's foreign policy. For generations, England had looked inward, concerned with dynastic squabbles and island politics. Now, under William, it was bound inseparably to the fate of continental Europe. England and the Dutch Republic united. The union of England and the Dutch Republic under William's leadership created a new axis of power. England brought resources, manpower, and a navy capable of challenging France on the seas. The Dutch contributed financial expertise, fortified cities, and decades of experience in resisting French arms. Together, they formed a partnership unique in Europe, a dual monarchy in practice, if not in name, with one man guiding the fortunes of two nations. In London, Parliament voted funds for war, sometimes grudgingly, but with the recognition that Louis XIV's ambitions threatened not just the Dutch, but all of Europe. In The Hague, Dutch statesmen rejoiced at the newfound weight of an English ally. The bond was sealed not by sentiment, but by necessity, forged in the crucible of shared danger. The balance of power against Louis XIV. At stake was nothing less than the future balance of power in Europe. Louis XIV. Envisioned a continent bent to French will, its borders secure behind mighty fortresses, its thrones occupied by Bourbon allies. His armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, seemed unstoppable, trained and provisioned with unmatched efficiency. The Grand Alliance, though diverse and often fractious, rallied around a single principle: that no single power should dominate the continent. This doctrine, the balance of power, was articulated more clearly than ever before during the 9 Years' War. It was not only dynastic ambition that guided William, but a vision of Europe preserved from hegemony, where smaller states might survive in the shadow of giants. For England, this was a new kind of war. It was not fought for conquests or colonies alone, but for the preservation of a system. In pamphlets and sermons, the struggle was cast as one of liberty against tyranny, Protestantism against Catholic absolutism, the many against the one, campaigns on land. The war itself sprawled across Europe, from the Rhineland to Catalonia, from Ireland to Savoy. William personally commanded armies in the Low Countries, where the clash between France and the Alliance was fiercest. The campaigns were grinding and indecisive, marked by sieges and maneuver rather than dramatic victories. At Fleurus, 1690, French forces triumphed, reminding Europe of Louis's military might. But William held the line in subsequent campaigns, preventing France from overrunning the Dutch Republic. At Namur, 1695, in one of the war's most celebrated sieges, the Alliance captured the fortress after weeks of bombardment, an achievement hailed as proof that France could be resisted. Though William was no brilliant tactician, his resilience was his strength. He endured defeats without despair and pressed on in the face of overwhelming odds. For his soldiers, he became a symbol of determination, a leader who shared their hardships in mud and rain, whose presence stiffened resolve even when victory seemed elusive. War at sea and abroad. The conflict extended to the seas, where England's navy clashed with France in a series of engagements that shaped the future of maritime power. At La Hogue, 1692, the Anglo-Dutch fleet decisively defeated the French, securing control of the Channel and preventing any attempt to restore James II by invasion. This victory confirmed England's emergence as a naval power capable of checking France's dominance. Beyond Europe, the war spilled into the colonies. In North America, it became known as King William's War, pitting English settlers and their indigenous allies against the French in Canada and their native partners. Raids and counter-raids ravaged the frontiers, bringing the European struggle into the New World. In the Caribbean and India, too, the conflict played out in skirmishes for trade and territory. The cost of war. The 9 Years' War was costly, draining the treasuries of every participant. In England, Parliament grappled with unprecedented demands for revenue. New systems of taxation, loans, and the creation of the Bank of England, 1694, were direct consequences of the war effort. These fiscal innovations, though controversial, laid the foundation of a modern financial state capable of sustaining prolonged conflict. The English people, too, bore the burdens. Taxes rose, trade suffered, and men were conscripted into armies and navies. Yet, despite weariness and grumbling, there was recognition that the stakes were high. That without resistance, Louis XIV would dominate not only the continent, but the seas, and perhaps the very fate of England itself. The Peace of Ryswick, 1697, after nearly a decade of struggle, exhaustion forced both sides to seek peace. In 1697, the Treaty of Ryswick ended the war. The terms were modest. France recognized William III as the legitimate king of England, abandoning James II. Territorial adjustments restored a precarious balance in the Low Countries. Louis retained much of his grandeur, but his aura of invincibility was dimmed. For William and his allies, the war was not a triumph of conquest, but a success of survival. The Grand Alliance had held together, France had been checked, and Europe's balance of power preserved. England emerged from the conflict not merely as a participant, but as a great power, bound to the destiny of the continent. The 9 Years' War was the international counterpart to the Glorious Revolution. Just as 1688 had reshaped England's constitution, so the war reshaped its role in Europe. William III had brought his adopted kingdom into the heart of continental politics, forging an Anglo-Dutch axis against Bourbon ambition. The war's legacy was lasting. The principle of balance of power, the partnership of England and the Dutch Republic, the rise of England's navy, and the foundations of a modern fiscal state. For England, the revolution at home had been glorious. Abroad, it was costly, arduous, and uncertain, but it marked the beginning of England's transformation into a European great power. In the mud of Flanders, the spray of the Channel, and the frontier forests of America, the Revolution of 1688 had found its echo. It was not enough to crown a new monarch. The fate of England was now entwined with the struggle for liberty and balance across all of Europe. Yet if the Revolution's echo across Europe was felt in treaties and alliances, within the kingdoms of the British Isles it resounded far more violently. For in Ireland and Scotland the flight of James II was not the end, but the beginning of bloody struggles. Ireland and Scotland. The glorious revolution had been achieved in England with astonishing speed, but across the Irish Sea and in the rugged highlands of Scotland, the story unfolded with far greater violence. Here, loyalty to the Stuarts did not evaporate with James II's flight. Instead, it hardened into rebellion, fueled by religion, identity, and the promise that the old king might yet reclaim his throne. The struggles in Ireland and Scotland gave the Revolution its bloodiest chapters, binding its legacy to triumph and tragedy alike. The Jacobite rising in Ireland became the first and fiercest battleground. For the Catholic majority, James II's exile was not a defeat, but a call to arms. When he landed at Kinsale in March 1689, escorted by French troops and promises of aid from Louis XIV, he was greeted as a king returned. Dublin swelled with loyalist fervor. Proclamations declared him the rightful sovereign, and Catholic nobles rallied to his cause. James hoped to use Ireland as a springboard to recover his English crown. The Catholic population, long oppressed under Protestant rule, saw in him their champion, one who might restore land and liberty. Under the leadership of Richard Talbot, Earl of Tyrconnell, the Jacobite army swelled with tens of thousands of recruits, many poorly armed but fiercely committed. Yet resistance was not absent. Protestant settlers, especially in Ulster, fortified towns against James's advance. The most famous stand came at Derry, where defenders held the walls through months of siege, starving but unyielding. Their defiance became a rallying cry for Williamite resistance, proof that not all Ireland would bow to James's banner. The Battle of the Boyne, 1690. The decisive moment came the following summer. In July 1690, William himself crossed into Ireland at the head of a multinational army of English, Dutch, Danish, and Huguenot troops. Opposite him stood James and his Jacobite host, bolstered by French advisors, camped along the banks of the River Boyne near Drogheda. The two armies faced each other in a tableau of Europe's Great Divide. Protestant coalition against Catholic monarch, Parliament's king against the king of divine right. As dawn broke on July 1st, cannons roared and muskets cracked across the river. William's men waded through water under fire, banners whipping in the wind, while cavalry splashed through fords to outflank the Jacobite line. The fighting was fierce but brief. William's disciplined troops pressed forward, and James's army faltered. By afternoon, the Jacobite position collapsed. James himself fled the field, retreating first to Dublin and then to France, earning the derisive nickname Seamus and Chaka, James the Shit, from his Irish supporters, who despised his cowardice. The Battle of the Boyne entered legend almost instantly. To Protestants, it was the triumph of liberty over tyranny, the moment William secured his throne. To Catholics, it was a bitter defeat, the shattering of hopes for restoration. Its anniversaries would be commemorated for centuries, emblazoned on banners and marching songs, fueling divisions that endured long beyond the 17th century. Aftermath in Ireland. The war did not end at the Boyne. Jacobite forces fought on until 1691, suffering defeats at Aughrim and Limerick. At last, the Treaty of Limerick promised toleration and property rights to Catholics who swore loyalty to William, but the promise was soon broken. The Irish Parliament, dominated by Protestants, enacted harsh penal laws that stripped Catholics of land, political power, and even basic freedoms. For the Catholic Irish, the Revolution's legacy was one of dispossession and subjugation. Where in England it meant liberty, in Ireland it meant conquest. Protestant settlers emerged dominant, their position entrenched for generations. The Protestant ascendancy was born, shaping Irish society until the 19th century. Scotland and the Highlands. In Scotland, too, the Revolution sparked conflict. Many in the lowlands, particularly Presbyterians, welcomed William and Mary as deliverers. But in the Highlands, loyalty to the Stuarts ran deep. Clan chiefs, bound by tradition and Catholic faith, rallied to James's cause in what became known as the Jacobite Rising of 1689. The Highlanders, fierce and mobile, won a stunning victory at Killiecrankie, where their charge shattered a government army. But the triumph was short-lived. Their leader, Viscount Dundee, was killed in the battle, and without him, the rising withered. By 1690, William's forces had reasserted control, though the embers of Jacobitism smoldered on, waiting to flare again in later decades. The broader meaning. The conflicts in Ireland and Scotland revealed the Revolution's double face. In England, it was remembered as bloodless, a triumph of law and liberty. But in the Celtic fringe, it was a war of sieges, massacres, and dispossession. For Protestants, it meant security and ascendancy. For Catholics, especially in Ireland, it meant centuries of exclusion. Yet these struggles also underscored the Revolution's European dimension. At the Boyne, Englishmen fought beside Dutch, Danes, and French Huguenots, a coalition of faith and politics stretching across borders. William's cause was not merely dynastic, but civilizational, a clash of systems that reverberated from Ulster to Versailles. By the early 1690s, William had secured his crowns in England, Ireland, and Scotland. James II lingered in exile at the French court, a king in name but not in power. The glorious revolution contested on 3 kingdoms had been won, but the cost was unevenly borne. In London, it heralded constitutional liberty. In Edinburgh, uneasy settlement. In Dublin, conquest and subjugation. Thus, the Revolution's legacy was as fractured as the islands themselves, glorious for some, disastrous for others. And in the divisions it left, especially in Ireland, the seeds of future conflict were sown, destined to outlast even William's reign and echo for centuries to come. And just as the Revolution unsettled kingdoms across the British Isles, its tremors did not stop at the shores. For across the Atlantic, in the English colonies, the events of 1688 offered both a precedent and an opportunity to redefine power and liberty. Impact on the English colonies. The Glorious Revolution was not confined to England, Ireland, or Scotland. Its reverberations crossed the Atlantic, carried by ships and whispers, reshaping the fragile settlements of North America. In towns of timber and clapboard, far from Westminster's halls, colonists seized upon the Revolution to assert their own visions of liberty and governance. For the English colonies, 1688 was not merely a European drama, it was a turning point in their own story. The Glorious Revolution in America. When word of James II's flight and William and Mary's accession reached the New World in 1689, it arrived in communities already restless. James's colonial policies had been deeply unpopular. His creation of the Dominion of New England in 1686 had stripped several colonies of their charters, abolishing local assemblies and placing power in the hands of royal governors. Taxes were imposed without consent, town meetings restricted, and the familiar rhythm of self-government disrupted. To settlers accustomed to managing their own affairs, the Dominion was tyranny in miniature. The Revolution in England became, across the ocean, an invitation to overthrow this experiment in absolutism. The Boston Revolt of 1689 nowhere did this sentiment explode more vividly than in Massachusetts. On April 18, 1689, the streets of Boston filled with armed townsmen, ministers, and merchants. Bells rang, muskets bristled, and the crowd surged against the seat of authority. Their target was Sir Edmund Andros, the royal governor imposed by James II, who had become the embodiment of despotic rule. The uprising unfolded with astonishing speed. Andros and his officials were seized, dragged through jeering crowds, and locked in the very fort they had once commanded. In pamphlets, colonists declared their revolt to be in defense of the Protestant religion and the liberties of the people, echoing the very slogans of William's invasion. Within days, the Dominion of New England collapsed, its authority dissolved. The Boston Revolt was no mere riot. It was the colonists' own glorious revolution, a declaration that governance must rest upon consent. For the first time, they had toppled royal authority, not by negotiation, but by force of their own will. Echoes in other colonies. The news from Boston rippled outward. In New York, factional rivalries boiled into the Leislers' Rebellion, where Jacob Leisler, a militia captain, seized control in the name of William and Mary. In Maryland, Protestant settlers rose against the Catholic proprietors, establishing Protestant control of the colony. Across the Atlantic seaboard, the Revolution became both rallying cry and justification, used to legitimize local power struggles and reshape colonial governance. Though chaotic, these uprisings shared a common thread. They drew inspiration from events in England, yet gave them colonial expression. To the settlers, the principles of 1688, resistance to arbitrary rule, defense of Protestant liberty, the right to representation, were not abstractions but immediate necessities. A step toward self-government. In the aftermath, royal authority in the colonies was reasserted, but never again in the same form. The Dominion of New England was abandoned, and colonial assemblies gradually regained their place. Governors continued to represent the crown, but they now faced entrenched local legislatures determined to protect their rights. The Revolution thus planted seeds of autonomy. It did not give the colonies independence, but it reinforced their conviction that legitimate government required consent. In the timber halls of New England and the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, the same principles debated in Westminster echoed: no taxation without representation, no rule without accountability. The glorious Revolution's legacy in America was both immediate and enduring. In the moment, it toppled governors, dissolved the Dominion, and restored colonial charters. In the longer view, it gave the colonists a political language they would wield for generations. When Boston's townsmen seized Andros, when Leisler raised his flag in New York, when Marylanders drove out Catholic lords, they were not merely reacting to English politics, they were rehearsing their own revolutions. The year 1689 thus marked a turning point, the moment when England's colonial children began to claim the principles of liberty for themselves, foreshadowing struggles yet to come. Yet the echoes of 1688 were not confined to colonial towns or distant plantations. At the very heart of the English state, the Revolution reshaped the crown itself, redefining what it meant to be a monarch in a kingdom now ruled as much by law as by lineage. Political significance. When William and Mary accepted the crown under the conditions laid down by Parliament in 1689, they did more than settle a succession crisis. They inaugurated a new political order, one that would alter not only England's governance but the very nature of monarchy itself. What emerged from the Glorious Revolution was not the abolition of kingship, but its transformation, a monarchy bound by law, sustained by consent, and balanced by Parliament. This settlement, fragile in its birth, became the foundation of what the world would come to call constitutional monarchy. The birth of constitutional monarchy. For centuries, English monarchs had ruled with claims of divine right, presenting themselves as sovereign above law, answerable only to God. James II had embodied that tradition, and in his fall, the principle was broken. The Bill of Rights and the Revolution settlement declared with unmistakable clarity the crown existed not by divine fiat alone, but by contract with the nation. Kings and queens could still reign, but their authority was conditional. They were custodians of law, not masters of it. They could not suspend statutes, impose taxes, or raise armies without Parliament's consent. The Revolution did not destroy monarchy, but it reshaped it into an office woven into the fabric of law and liberty. The imagery of 1689 reflected this change. William and Mary were crowned in the grandeur of Westminster Abbey, yet their thrones stood upon parchment. The contracts, statutes, and declarations that circumscribed their power, Majesty endured, but it was majesty framed and limited, a crown gleaming not in absolute authority, but in constitutional restraint. The foundations of parliamentary democracy. The Revolution also gave Parliament a new role, not merely as a council of the realm, but as the heart of governance. The Commons in particular gained fresh confidence, wielding the power of the purse to shape policy and hold ministers accountable. Each session of Parliament became an arena where the nation's business was debated, taxes approved, and laws enacted, not by royal decree but by the deliberation of representatives. The principle was revolutionary. Legitimacy flowed through Parliament as much as through the Crown. It was Parliament that had invited William and Mary, Parliament that defined the conditions of their reign, Parliament that stood as guardian of the liberties of Englishmen. From this moment onward, English governance was not the voice of one monarch, but the balance of crown, lords, and commons, each checking the other. Though the electorate remained narrow and corruption rife, the principle of parliamentary democracy was planted. Over the next centuries, reform would widen the franchise and strengthen representation, but the seed had been sown in 1689. That authority must be accountable, and that the people, through their representatives, had a rightful place in the governance of the realm. A model for the modern world. The significance of this settlement extended beyond England's shores. In the coffeehouses of Amsterdam, the salons of Paris, and the assemblies of America, observers watched with fascination as England charted a path between absolutism and anarchy. Where France exalted Louis XIV in the splendor of Versailles, England crowned a monarch under parliamentary conditions. Where other kingdoms teetered between rebellion and repression, England established a working partnership between ruler and ruled. The model was imperfect, riddled with exclusions and inequalities, yet it proved enduring. Constitutional monarchy offered continuity without despotism, stability without stagnation. It allowed kings and queens to embody the nation's unity while leaving governance to elected assemblies. It provided a way for tradition and liberty to coexist, a balance rare in the tumult of early modern Europe. The political significance of the Glorious Revolution lay not in a single battle or a single law, but in a transformation of principle. Monarchy was preserved, yet made conditional. Parliament was strengthened, yet bound to cooperate with the Crown. Liberty was declared, though imperfectly shared. From the storms of 1688 to 1689 emerged a new constitution, unwritten yet undeniable, that would guide England into the modern age. The Revolution did not complete democracy, but it set its cornerstone, that power must be checked, that authority must rest on consent, and that governance must be bound by law. Thus, the Glorious Revolution gave birth to a system that endures still, a monarchy constitutional, a parliament sovereign, and a people slowly awakening to their role in shaping the destiny of their nation. Yet the Revolution's meaning was not confined to parliaments and politics. It reached as deeply into the soul of the nation as into its laws. For in 1689, England did not simply redefine monarchy, it redrew the map of faith itself. Religious significance. If the Glorious Revolution was a triumph of politics, it was equally a settlement of religion. The Revolution did not only crown new monarchs, it enshrined a confession, drew boundaries of belief, and defined the spiritual character of the kingdom. In its wake, England became unmistakably an Anglican nation, Protestant in its laws and institutions, wary of Catholic influence, and cautiously tolerant of dissenters. The ascendancy of Anglicanism, central to the settlement, was the confirmation of the Church of England as the established church. The Revolution declared that the crown must be Protestant, excluding Catholics from the throne in perpetuity. This was not mere doctrine, it was a political safeguard. To many in 1689, Catholic monarchy meant absolutism, foreign interference, and the shadow of Louis XIV. By binding monarchy and Anglicanism together, Parliament ensured that no future king could repeat James II's attempt to steer the nation back toward Rome. The coronation oath itself was rewritten, obliging William and Mary, and every monarch thereafter, to uphold the Protestant faith as defined by the Church of England. Bishops and clergy, though shaken by the Revolution, emerged with their position secure. Anglican liturgy remained the language of national worship. Anglican bishops continued to sit in the House of Lords. The church, entwined with state, was confirmed as guardian of the realm's spiritual identity. Catholic exclusion for Catholics, however, the revolution was a bitter blow. Already distrusted after years of plots, wars, and persecution, they now found themselves explicitly barred from power. The Bill of Rights and subsequent Act of Settlement enshrined anti-Catholic provisions in law, forbidding any Catholic, or even anyone married to a Catholic, from inheriting the crown. Catholics were further marginalized in society. Though tolerated in private worship, they were excluded from Parliament, public office, and much of civic life. In Ireland, as seen after the Williamite Wars, this exclusion hardened into a system of penal laws that stripped Catholics of land and rights. For them, the Revolution's promise of liberty was not freedom, but deepened subjugation, relative toleration for dissenters. Protestant dissenters, by contrast, gained breathing space. The Toleration Act of 1689 allowed Presbyterians, Baptists, and Quakers to worship openly, provided they swore loyalty to the crown. Their chapels dotted the landscape, and their ministers preached without fear of imprisonment. Yet toleration was limited. Dissenters could not hold public office, attend the universities of Oxford or Cambridge, or fully share in the political life of the realm. Thus, the Revolution drew a careful balance. It secured Anglican supremacy, excluded Catholics, but permitted dissenters a space within the national fabric. It was neither persecution nor equality, but a compromise born of necessity. The religious significance of the Glorious Revolution was profound. It bound Crown and Church of England in an indissoluble alliance, ensuring that monarchy would remain Protestant. It banished Catholicism from the corridors of power, while granting dissenters a fragile but real toleration. This settlement was not perfect. It entrenched exclusion even as it widened freedom. Yet it stabilized a kingdom torn by a century of religious strife. Where fire and sword had once sought to impose uniformity, parchment and statute now defined the boundaries of faith. The Glorious Revolution, in its religious dimension, was both a triumph and a compromise. Triumph for Anglicanism, reprieve for dissenters, exclusion for Catholics. And in that compromise lay its durability, a religious order that, however flawed, could endure. Yet the Revolution's true legacy was not confined to pulpits or statutes. It also took root in the realm of ideas, where thinkers began to translate its compromises into principles of government that would outlast the age itself. Long-term influence on political thought. The Glorious Revolution was not only a reshaping of laws and institutions, it was a revolution of the mind. The principles forged in 1688 to 1689 transcended their moment, inspiring philosophers, pamphleteers, and reformers across the world. At the center of this intellectual transformation stood John Locke, whose writings distilled the Revolution's meaning into a theory of government that would echo for centuries. John Locke and the Social Contract Locke's two treatises of government, published in 1689, became the intellectual companion of the Revolution. In its pages, Locke rejected the divine right of kings, declaring instead that political authority rested on a social contract between ruler and ruled. Government existed to secure life, liberty, and property. When it failed in that duty, the people retained the right to resist and replace it. This was not abstract speculation. Locke wrote in the very context of James II's fall and William and Mary's accession. The Revolution to him was proof that kings could be held accountable, that sovereignty derived not from heaven, but from human consent. The principles of 1689 thus became principles of philosophy, natural rights, limited government, the legitimacy of resistance. The power of Locke's vision lay in its universality. What had begun as a particular English crisis was elevated into a doctrine of human governance. He gave the Revolution not only legality, but moral authority, clothing it in the language of reason and rights. Impact on America. Nowhere did these ideas bear greater fruit than in the English colonies of North America. Already stirred by their own experience of the Revolution in 1689, colonists found in Locke's arguments a justification for their aspirations. His phrases, life, liberty, property, became watchwords across the Atlantic. When the colonies clashed with Britain in the 18th century, they reached instinctively for the language of 1689. The American Revolution of 1776 was, in many ways, the glorious revolution carried across the ocean. The Declaration of Independence echoed Locke's principles, declaring that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. George III was cast as a new James II, accused of breaking the contract and thus deserving deposition. In this sense, the shot fired at Lexington was an echo of 1688. The American Revolution was not a rejection of England's legacy, but its extension, an attempt to claim in full the liberties first sketched in the Bill of Rights and Locke's treatises, influence on France and beyond. The Revolution's ideas also leapt into continental Europe, carried in whispers, translations, and debates. French intellectuals chafing under Bourbon absolutism studied England's settlement with fascination. Voltaire praised England's balance of crown and parliament, contrasting it with the rigidity of Versailles. By the time of 1789, the French Revolution drew upon Locke's vision of natural rights and the sovereignty of the people, even as it pursued them with far greater radicalism. Elsewhere, the Revolution's legacy fed into the broader Enlightenment. It demonstrated that liberty could be institutionalized, that monarchy could be limited without anarchy, that laws could bind rulers as well as subjects. For reformers in the Netherlands, Germany, and even Latin America, England's example offered a model of how to resist absolutism and imagine new political orders, an enduring legacy. The Glorious Revolution was thus more than an event. It was a fountainhead of political modernity. Its principles, constitutional monarchy, parliamentary sovereignty, the rights of conscience, and the accountability of rulers, became the common vocabulary of democracy. The revolution did not create universal freedom, but it planted a seed that germinated across continents and centuries. Locke's pen, the colonists' muskets, the revolutionaries' banners in Paris, all bore the imprint of 1688. It was the moment when England's domestic crisis became the world's inheritance. Conclusion: the turning point of a nation. The story of the Glorious Revolution began with a king who overreached, a parliament that resisted, and a foreign prince who answered the call of English nobles. It unfolded across palaces and parliaments, battlefields and pamphlets, rivers and colonies. It ended not in flames, but in settlement, yet a settlement that reshaped the course of history. In England, it established a constitutional monarchy, balancing crown and parliament in a partnership that endures to this day. In Ireland and Scotland, it left scars of conquest and division, reminding us that liberty for some came at the expense of others. In America and beyond, it sowed ideas that would ignite revolutions of their own, shaping the modern age. The revolution was called glorious, not because it was without conflict. It was bloody in Ulster, bitter in Limerick, and costly across Europe, but because it achieved something rare: the redefinition of power through principle, the taming of monarchy by law, and the birth of constitutional liberty. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, England emerged not merely with new rulers, but with a new political identity. The Glorious Revolution was the hinge of history, a turning point where monarchy bent, parliament rose, and liberty took root. Its echoes still resound in parliaments and congresses, in constitutions and declarations, wherever people assert that rulers must serve, not command. It was truly a revolution for the ages.